right, buckle up because we're diving deep into some seriously thought-provoking stuff today. We're tackling C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. And we're not stopping there. We're also exploring Screwtape proposes a toast. Ever wondered what it would be like to see the world through a demon's eyes? Well, that's exactly what Lewis gives us in these brilliant works. It's like peeking behind the curtain of the spiritual realm. We get to eavesdrop on Screwtape, a senior demon, as he mentors his nephew, Wormwood. Wormwood's a junior tempter, learning the ropes and their target, the human soul.
What makes this book so gripping is the perspective shift. Instead of focusing on being good, it unveils those sneaky strategies that evil uses to pull us off course. It's truly eye-opening.
So in the beginning, Screwtape's advice to Wormwood is surprisingly ordinary. It's not about huge dramatic temptations, but about those tiny, everyday distractions. The kind that can throw our spiritual lives off track without us even realizing it.
Exactly. He tells Wormwood to exploit the patient's daily commute, for instance, get him so absorbed in the newsboys' headlines, or the chaos of the births, that he loses sight of the bigger picture, the eternal questions that really matter.
It's so relatable, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've all been there, lost in our to-do list, the latest news, the everyday hustle. And Lewis shows us how easily these distractions can become spiritual stumbling blocks.
It goes deeper than just losing track of time, though. Screwtape's after something far more sinister. He wants to redirect the patient's focus from real life, as he calls it, to a world of manufactured anxieties and desires.
So instead of contemplating God, his place in the universe, the patient gets bogged down in the little things, worrying about stuff that ultimately doesn't matter.
Precisely. It's the classic bait and switch. Distract him with the temporary and the insignificant, and he'll never even think to seek out the eternal and the profound.
And it's not just about the bus or the newsboy, is it? Screwtape's got a whole bag of tricks, all about using our everyday experiences against us. He even suggests twisting the patient's time at church to turn him away from faith.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Screwtape tells Wormwood to draw the patient's attention to the flaws of others in the congregation, their looks, their singing, anything to make him feel superior and judgmental. He's basically weaponizing community, the very thing that should bring people closer to God.
It's so sneaky. And what's even wilder? Screwtape even tries to exploit the patient's relationship with his mother.
That's right.
He encourages Wormwood to make the patient focus on her annoying habits, her tone, her every little flaw. He wants to turn a loving bond into a source of resentment.
It's insidious because it plays on our natural tendency to judge. We all have those moments, right? Getting irritated by someone's quirks, especially those closest to us. But Screwtape takes us to a whole other level. He wants to transform those minor irritations into huge offenses, fueling bitterness and estrangement between the patient and his mother.
It's like he's warping reality, making the patient constantly defensive, seeing insults where none were intended. What's the end game here? What does Screwtape hope to achieve by driving a wedge between them?
Isolation. Remember, God is love, and love thrives in community. So if Screwtape can isolate the patient, cut him off from the support and encouragement of loved ones, he's far more susceptible to temptation.
And all of this, the distractions, the judgment, the strained relationships, it all points to a deeper tactic. He wants to keep the patient focused on externals, on the faults of others, on his own petty complaints, anything to stop him from looking inward, from confronting his own weaknesses, and seeking true spiritual growth.
You got it. Screwtape knows that self-reflection is dangerous. It's the first step towards repentance, towards recognizing our need for God. So he does everything he can to keep the patient distracted, to keep him from ever facing his own soul.
It's chilling, but also incredibly insightful. It makes you realize just how subtle the enemy's tactics can be. And it challenges us to be more aware of the things that distract us, the judgments we make, the way we treat those closest to us.
Absolutely. Awareness is key. Once we recognize these patterns of temptation in our own lives, we can start to resist them. And that's when things get really interesting. Because the more the patient resists, the more desperate and creative Screwtape becomes.
Okay, you've definitely got my attention. What happens when the patient starts fighting back?
Well, Screwtape has another trick up his sleeve. A pretty profound observation about human nature. He calls it the law of undulation.
The law of undulation. I've never heard of that. What is it exactly?
It's Screwtape's way of describing the natural ebb and flow of human emotions. And spiritual fervor, too. He recognizes that we're not static beings. We have our peaks and valleys in every area of life, including our faith.
So you're saying it's normal to have ups and downs in our spiritual lives? That we shouldn't expect to feel close to God all the time?
Absolutely, it's part of the human experience. And of course, Screwtape sees this as a golden opportunity. He tells Wormwood to pay close attention to these spiritual shifts and adapt his strategies accordingly.
So how does he suggest Wormwood handle these peaks and valleys?
He advises him to exploit both, the peaks and the troughs. During the troughs, when the patient's feeling spiritually dry and uninspired, he suggests tempting him with sensual pleasures. But it's not just about pushing him towards outright debauchery. It's much more subtle than that.
I'm intrigued. What kind of sensual pleasures is he talking about?
He encourages a certain style of indulgence, a focus on taking without giving, on chasing fleeting pleasures to numb the dryness, instead of seeking true joy in God. Think about it. How often do we try to fill that spiritual void with things that only offer temporary satisfaction? Food, entertainment, shopping. The list goes on.
It's like we're trying to medicate the emptiness with a constant stream of distractions instead of addressing the root cause.
Precisely. That's exactly what Screwtape wants. He doesn't want the patient to experience genuine joy, because true joy is a sign of God's presence. He wants him to settle for cheap substitutes, those fleeting moments of pleasure that ultimately leave him feeling even emptier.
It's so insidious because it all seems harmless on the surface, a little indulgence here, a little distraction there, but it's all part of a grand scheme to keep the patient from finding true fulfillment in God.
Now, what about the spiritual peaks? How does Screwtape advise Wormwood to deal with those?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. If the troughs are about temptation and distraction, what are the peaks about?
Well, Screwtape sees those peaks, those moments of intense spiritual fervor, as dangerous, because they could lead the patient to a deeper commitment to God. So his goal is to make the patient misunderstand those spiritual highs. He might try to convince him that he's reached some permanent state of enlightenment, leading to pride and complacency, or he might try to make him despair when the inevitable dryness returns, suggesting that the previous experience was just a fluke, a temporary emotional high.
He even tells Wormwood to use the word phase, to dismiss any genuine spiritual experience the patient might have. That's brilliant, really. A way to downplay the significance of the patient's spiritual journey, to make him doubt the authenticity of his own encounter with God.
It's a tactic that's all too familiar in our culture, isn't it? We're constantly told that religious experiences are just emotional outbursts, psychological phenomena that science can explain away. But Screwtape's perspective reveals a deeper truth. He's terrified of these experiences precisely because they're genuine encounters with the divine.
It makes you think twice about how we often dismiss or downplay spiritual experiences, both our own and those of others. Maybe there's more to it than we realize.
And here's where Screwtape's perspective gets really interesting. He actually shows a grudging respect for the troughs, for those periods of spiritual dryness.
Wait. Why would a demon prefer it when the patient is struggling? I'd think he'd be happy when the patient's feeling distant from God.
That's what's so fascinating about this book. Screwtape actually prefers it when the patient's going through a trough. Because, as he puts it, it's during those times that the patient is growing into the sort of creature he wants it to be. He recognizes that true spiritual growth often happens amidst struggle, in those moments when we feel most alone and vulnerable.
So he's basically saying suffering can bring us closer to God. That's a pretty heavy concept.
It is. And it's something many spiritual traditions acknowledge. Sometimes it's in the midst of pain, doubt, and despair that we're forced to confront our deepest selves and our need for something beyond ourselves.
I'm thinking about those times when I've really struggled in my faith, when I felt like giving up. Looking back, those are often the times I learned the most about myself and about God.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Screwtape dreads this kind of perseverance in the patient. He understands that obedience, even in the face of dryness and doubt, is a victory for God. And he's terrified of the patient reaching that point, where he no longer desires to do God's will, but still chooses to do it anyway, out of pure love and devotion.
So it's about choosing faith, even when we don't feel it. About acting on our beliefs, even when our emotions are pulling us in a different direction.
Exactly. It's a powerful message, even coming from a demon. The idea that our struggles, those moments of dryness and doubt, can actually be opportunities for growth. That true faith is about perseverance, about choosing to obey even when we don't feel like it. It's a reminder that the spiritual life isn't about fleeting emotions, but about the steadfastness of our will.
That's a great point. It's not about feeling good all the time. It's about making a conscious decision to follow God, even when it's hard. And that takes us right into the next chapter of the patient's journey, and Screwtape's increasingly desperate attempts to derail him. Let's look at how Screwtape reacts when the patient finds a new circle of friends.
This is where Screwtape's strategies become more social, exploiting the power of peer pressure. and the human need to belong, to undermine the patient's faith.
Hold on, before we jump into that, can we just pause for a second and let all that sink in? This law of undulation. It's really resonating with me. It's such a relief to know that these ups and downs are normal, that I'm not the only one who experiences them.
And it's incredibly empowering too, right? Knowing that even in those moments of dryness and doubt, we can still choose to move towards God. That's true freedom.
Okay, I'm ready for the next chapter. Let's see what Screwtape is playing now.
Okay, so we left off with the patient starting to push back against some of Screwtape's tricks, but just when you think Screwtape's losing his grip, things get even more interesting.
All right, I'm hooked. What happens next?
The patient enters a new phase of life. He finds himself drawn to this sophisticated, cynical group of friends. And as you can imagine, Screwtape is absolutely thrilled.
Hold on, why would he be happy about that? I thought good company was supposed to, keep us on the right path.
True, but these aren't exactly what you'd call good company. Screwtape sees them as prime tools for undermining the patient's faith.
So how does he plan to use them?
He advises Wormwood to encourage the patient to hide his faith from these new friends, to make him feel ashamed of his beliefs. It's all about exploiting that human need to fit in, to avoid being the odd one out.
Peer pressure, but on a spiritual level. And I bet it's incredibly effective. It's hard enough to stand up for what you believe in when you're surrounded by like-minded people.
Yeah.
But when you're the only one, it takes real guts to resist conforming.
Exactly. And that's precisely what Screwtape wants. He wants to wear down the patient's resolve, make him question his beliefs just because they're not shared by those around him.
So it's not just about hiding his faith, right? It's about making him feel like his beliefs are outdated or irrelevant, maybe even a little embarrassing.
Precisely. And it's not just about shame either. Screwtape also encourages Wormwood to use humor as a weapon.
Humor? How can humor be a bad thing?
It's not humor itself, but how it's used. Screwtape suggests using jokes and witty remarks to desensitize the patient to sin, to make light of things that should be taken seriously. Like those jokes that poke fun at moral principles or religious beliefs.
Right, they might seem harmless on the surface, but they subtly chip away at our sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. It creates a culture where nothing is sacred, where everything's up for grabs. This kind of cynical humor can be incredibly corrosive, especially for someone still figuring out their own moral compass.
So it's not enough to just be aware of the bad influences in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
We also have to be mindful of the humor we consume and how we use it ourselves. It's a reminder that even something as simple as a joke can impact our spiritual lives.
Now, alongside this cynical humor, Screwtape encourages Wormwood to subtly twist the patient's understanding of Christianity. He wants faith to become a status symbol, not a genuine belief.
So like wearing your faith as a badge of honor, a way to fit in with a certain group or impress people?
Exactly. It becomes a way to elevate oneself, to feel superior. But it's all surface, no depth.
Which is, of course, the opposite of true humility.
You got it. That's what Screwtape is after. Replacing genuine faith with a shallow imitation, turning the patient into a hypocrite.
It's scary how easily that can happen. We can get so caught up in the externals of faith, belonging to the right church, knowing the right people, saying the right things, that we lose sight of the inner transformation that's at the heart of it all.
It's a timeless temptation, and something we all need to watch out for, because true faith isn't about conforming to expectations. It's about aligning ourselves with God's will, even when it's unpopular.
It makes you wonder if Screwtape might be behind some of those social media posts, where people are more about showing off their spiritual perfection than sharing their real struggles and triumphs.
You might be onto something there. Now, while all this social maneuvering is happening, a rather unexpected event throws a wrench into Screwtape's plans. War breaks out.
War? What does war have to do with spiritual warfare?
Well, you might think a demon would relish the chaos and suffering of war. And while Screwtape does enjoy a good dose of human misery, he realizes that war can backfire.
What do you mean? How can war be bad for a demon?
As much as Screwtape loves seeing humans turn on each other, he knows war can have an unintended consequence. It can drive people towards God.
That makes sense. In times of crisis, people often turn to faith for comfort and strength.
Exactly, and that's the last thing Screwtape wants. He'd much rather see people die comfortably numb, distracted by worldly concerns, than face death aware of their need for God.
So war creates this existential crisis. It forces people to confront the big questions about life and death, and that can lead them to seek answers in faith.
You got it. And that's not all. Screwtape also complains that prolonged suffering can actually strengthen faith, making people more resilient and more reliant on God.
So it's like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger? But with a spiritual twist.
Exactly. And that's why Screwtape is so conflicted about war. On one hand, he enjoys the spectacle of human suffering, but on the other hand, he knows it can backfire, leading to a surge in faith and deeper relationships with God.
It's a fascinating paradox. It makes you realize that even the toughest experiences can have a redemptive side, a way of refining our faith and drawing us closer to God.
It's a powerful reminder that God can work through even the darkest circumstances. And it gives us hope that even in the midst of war and suffering, there's always potential for spiritual growth and transformation.
Now, amidst all the chaos of war, the patient experiences another major life change. He falls in love. I'm guessing Screwtape isn't too thrilled about that.
You would be right. This throws Screwtape into a frenzy. He sees love as one of the biggest threats to his plans.
Why is that? I mean, love is supposed to be a good thing, right?
It is, but Screwtape recognizes that love has this power to connect people to something beyond themselves, to open their hearts to God, and that's the last thing he wants.
So how does he plan to sabotage the patient's new love?
Oh, he's got plenty of tricks for this one. First, he tries to convince the patient that being in love is all there is, that once the initial excitement fades, the relationship's over, like setting them up for disappointment before they even begin.
Like those whirlwind romances that burn bright and fast, but fizzle out because there's no real substance.
Exactly. Screwtape wants the patient to believe love is just a fleeting emotion, not a commitment, not a choice, not a sacrifice.
So how does he advise Wormwood to do this?
He tells Wormwood to exploit the intensity of that being in love phase, encourage the patient to focus on his own feelings, rather than the needs of the woman he loves. He wants to turn love into a selfish pursuit, a way for the patient to get his needs met, not a way to serve and cherish another person.
It's like he wants to turn love into a transaction, keeping score instead of giving freely.
You got it. And that's just the beginning. He also tries to twist the idea of unselfishness, encouraging the patient to be generous in ways that actually benefit himself. It's a subtle manipulation, disguising self-interest as love.
Like those people who do favors for others, but only because they expect something in return. It's not true generosity, it's control in disguise.
Exactly. And that's something we need to be aware of in our own relationships. Are we giving freely out of love? Or are we keeping score, expecting something back? True love is selfless, sacrificial, and it doesn't keep tabs.
That's a powerful reminder. Now, another tactic Screwtape uses is to shift the patient's focus from the present to the future. Why is he so obsessed with the future?
Screwtape knows the future is always uncertain, and he can use that uncertainty to create fear, anxiety, and false hope. He talks about the allure of political utopias, scientific progress, all those grand narratives that promise a better world, but keep us from focusing on the present.
It's like we're always chasing some future ideal, some perfect state of being, instead of appreciating what we have right now.
Exactly. Screwtape wants to distract the patient with promises of a future paradise, knowing that the present moment, the only time we can truly experience God, is slipping away.
It's so relatable, isn't it? How often do we get caught up in our plans for the future? Our worries about what might happen, that we forget to enjoy the beauty and blessings of right now.
It's a constant temptation. But Screwtape's insights, as twisted as they are, remind us to be present, to ground ourselves in the reality of our lives, and not get swept away by speculation and fear.
Okay, I'm getting the sense that Screwtape's getting a little desperate. War, love, the present moment, these are all pretty big threats to his plans. What else does he have up his sleeve?
Well, he turns his attention to something rather unexpected. The patient's relationship with food.
Food? Really? I mean, I know gluttony's a sin, but it doesn't seem as serious as some of the other stuff we've been talking about.
You might be surprised. Screwtape has some fascinating and frankly disturbing insights into how our relationship with food can reflect our spiritual state.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Let's dig in.
So we're talking about food. And remember, Screwtape's all about those subtle manipulations, those seemingly small vices that can slowly pull us away from God. And he sees gluttony, not just in the overeating sense, but in a more refined way, as a powerful tool.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of gluttony are we talking about?
He calls it gluttony of delicacy. He uses the patient's mother as a prime example, describing her obsession with having things just so, even if it means inconveniencing others. It's not about quantity, but this insatiable desire for a very particular, often elusive sensory experience.
So like those people who are super picky eaters, always sending their food back or demanding things be prepared a certain way.
Exactly, and it goes beyond just food. It's about this preoccupation with refinement and exclusivity, a need for the best of everything. even at the expense of others.
And what's the spiritual danger here? How does this gluttony of delicacy pull us away from God?
Screwtape points out that this type of gluttony breeds discontent. And self-centeredness, too. It makes us constantly focus on our own desires, our own need for gratification, instead of the needs of those around us. We become so fixated on getting what we want that we lose sight of the bigger picture, the importance of generosity, compassion, selflessness.
It's like that saying, comparison is the thief of joy. When we're always chasing the best and comparing ourselves, we can't be truly content.
Exactly. And it creates a sense of entitlement, this belief that we deserve things our way, that our preferences are superior.
It makes you realize how easily these seemingly harmless preferences can turn into vices.
And what's fascinating is how Screwtape ties us back to the patient's mother. He points out how her gluttony of delicacy, her constant demands and fussiness, have likely contributed to years of tension at home.
So it's not just about the individual, it's about how our vices can impact those around us, creating this ripple effect of discontent.
Exactly. And Screwtape, being the strategist he is, sees an opportunity here.
So he's not just targeting the patient's gluttony directly, he's also using the mother's behavior to influence the patient.
Precisely. He suggests using the patient's vanity, his desire to appear sophisticated and discerning, to turn him into a glutton of delicacy as well.
So it starts innocently enough, an interest in good food and drink, but it becomes this obsession with sensory pleasure.
Exactly. And that's where the danger lies, because once you're in that state, your charity, your justice, your obedience, all becomes secondary to the pursuit of pleasure.
It's a sobering thought. It makes you realize we need to be mindful of our motivations, even in something like our relationship with food.
Now, while all this is going on, Screwtape introduces another fascinating concept, the idea of time as a tool for temptation.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. How can time be a temptation?
Well, Screwtape observes that the patient has this sense of ownership over time. He feels like his time is being stolen when he has to work, or attend to his religious duties, or do anything that doesn't directly serve his own interests.
I can definitely relate to that. It's easy to feel like our time is precious, something we need to protect.
And that's exactly what Screwtape wants. He wants to cultivate this sense of ownership, because it feeds into a broader sense of entitlement and self-centeredness. It makes the patient resist surrendering his time to God, or to serving others, to doing anything that requires sacrifice or inconvenience.
So it's about control. We want to control our time, our schedules, our lives. We resist letting go.
Precisely. And Screwtape points out how ridiculous this notion of owning time is. We can't create time. We can't control it. It's a gift, a fleeting moment. And yet we act like it's ours to hoard.
We forget we're just stewards of our time, not the ultimate owners. And how we spend our time reflects our values, our priorities, ultimately our relationship with God.
Exactly. Now, as we approach the climax of the letters, Screwtape focuses on a danger that often arises as the patient becomes more integrated into his Christian community: spiritual pride.
It seems odd that spiritual progress could lead to pride. Wouldn't getting closer to God make us more humble?
You'd think so. But Screwtape sees the patient's newfound zeal, his eagerness to learn and grow in his faith, as a prime opportunity.
How so? How can he twist something positive like spiritual growth into a negative?
He encourages the patient to develop a sense of superiority, to look down on those who haven't reached his level of understanding. He wants the patient to become a spiritual snob, more concerned with appearing righteous than actually being righteous.
It's like he's saying, now you're in the in crowd, look down on the out crowd.
Yeah.
Classic divide and conquer.
Exactly. And it's something we all need to watch out for, because true humility isn't about thinking less of ourselves, but about thinking of ourselves less. It's about recognizing we're all on a journey, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and we all need God's grace.
A good reminder that no matter how far we progress, we're never beyond temptation's reach.
Now, despite all of Screwtape's schemes and manipulations, something remarkable happens. The patient perseveres.
So Screwtape's plans fail. What happens to the patient?
Despite intense temptations and unimaginable suffering, the patient stays faithful. He weathers the storms of war, finds true love, and deepens his relationship with God.
It's amazing. What's Screwtape's reaction?
He's furious, of course, but what's striking is his reaction to the patient's death. He doesn't mourn the loss of a soul. He's enraged at being defeated. He rants and raves about the unfairness of it all, revealing a deep hatred for God and humanity.
It reminds us that the spiritual battle is real, and the stakes are high.
Now, before we wrap up, we need to touch on Screwtape proposes a toast. It's a chillingly relevant addition to the letters.
What's the main point of the toast?
Screwtape shifts his focus to the modern world, specifically the education system. He praises how it subtly undermines traditional values and independent thought, molding young minds to be more receptive to, well, demonic influence.
That's unsettling. How does he see education as a tool for evil?
He argues that instead of promoting critical thinking and a love for learning, modern education often encouraged conformity, a passive acceptance of the status quo. It teaches students to just absorb information without questioning it, making them vulnerable to manipulation.
That's a sobering thought.
Mm-hmm.
It emphasizes the importance of being critical thinkers, of questioning assumptions, thinking for ourselves, and actively seeking truth.
Exactly. And it highlights the need to cultivate a love for learning, a thirst for knowledge that goes beyond just memorizing facts. It's about developing that ability to think critically, to analyze information and form our own conclusions.
This has been an incredible journey. The Screwtape letters really challenge us to examine our vulnerabilities, to be aware of the enemy's tactics, and to fight for our souls with everything we've got.
And Screwtape proposes a toast, adds to that. It's a warning about complacency and conformity, urging us to protect our minds and hearts.
What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Even when surrounded by darkness, goodness wins. Even the most cunning demon can be defeated. And that should give us hope, because it means we can overcome our challenges too. We just have to remember we're not alone in this fight.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of a demon. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the curious and the intriguing.